This is Comic Geek Speak, episode 1693. CGS goes to war.
I'm Adam Murdo.
And I'm Chris Eberly.
Oh, I do envision our dear departed brother-in-arms, Jamie D, smiling down on us as I played that selection. You know, as a producer of the show, he was always fond of fun with real audio and just special gimmick music now and then. And so this is a salute to you, Jamie, and also a salute to my fellow geek Chris and all of you out there listening in the ranks as we embark upon this new experimental format of Comic Geek Speak, Comic Talk, CGS Goes to War, about which more in a moment. But first of all, a word from our sponsor for this episode, which is the Collection Drawer Company. Friends, are you finding that your collection is beginning to stack up on you at home? Are you finding it increasingly a problem to access certain comics in your collection because they're in a long box in the bottom of a stack of long boxes, and you can't lift that pesky lid off the top of that bottom box without lifting all the other long boxes off first? Well, fret no more, friends, because your friends at the Collection Drawer Company at collectiondrawer.com have the solution to your problem. It is Drawer Boxes, the easy comics access storage solution. And the difference between a traditional long box and a drawer box is that, well, they're built on the same concept, but the drawer box, instead of having a top-lifting lid, is sealed inside of a outer cardboard shell, open at one end, so that the inner drawer box pulls out of the front like a drawer. There's no need to lift a lid and no need to lift all the other boxes off that lid before you lift that lid, because you can just pull out that drawer and the comics are right there. And plus, that outer cardboard shell is super reinforced, even more so than they used to be. The Drawer Box Company recently doubled the sheets of upgraded weight paper in each outer shell, so that you've now got double the protection for your comics. They used to only do that for the magazine-sized drawer boxes. Now they offer it for all the different sizes and shapes of drawer boxes. So they're double reinforced, double the protection for your collection. It makes it possible to stack those boxes up at least 5 high in a stack. So you can get your comics more easily, and you can rest assured that they are protected inside their armor. They offer these drawer boxes in a variety of shapes and sizes, so you can get them to store magazines, LP records, action figures, etc., not just your standard-sized comic books. They also offer accessories, such as the Box Locks anchors, which improve stability for partially full boxes and provides even better long-term stacking strength, and also prevents tipping. And the Box Sort inserts, which are cardboard sheets that prevent slipping, sliding, and tipping of the comics within your drawer boxes, and also help to organize the collection a little bit better. They help to mark where one series ends and another begins within the box. And if you happen to have a large collection of traditional long boxes that need to be converted to drawer boxes, fear not, they also offer volume discounts for large orders at collectiondrawer.com. So go to that website, enter in that URL I just said, collectiondrawer.com, and see what the Collection Drawer Company can do to help you organize your collection and bring it closer to your fingertips. They are our sponsor for this episode, and we do appreciate their help. They make a fine product.
Murd, I want to compliment you on taking sort of a late 50s TV announcer approach to that particular sponsorship. That was well done, sir.
Thank you. It's just my tip of the cap to our illustrious founder, Brian Deemer's "My Laws, Baby, My Laws" speech of many years ago.
I remember that. And again, the selection of the theme from Patton for this episode was right on the money. And it did remind me of those months that Jamie D was in the producer's chair and all the fun music he selected for various episodes and bits from cartoons and so forth. So bravo, sir.
Yep.
Bravo.
I'm pretty sure he would have been chair marching along with Jerry Goldsmith's theme there.
Indeed.
A further word from Central Command here before we get underway. I'd like to remind everyone about the ongoing voting that's happening now for our annual Comic Geek Speak Best of Awards for the Best of 2017. We recently announced the nominees for all the different worthy comics creators, etc. of 2017 in a special nominations episode. Now the polls are open for you to vote among those nominees across 16 categories for what you think were the best comics and creators of that year. You can go to thecomicforums.vanillaforums.com for a complete list of all the nominees across those 16 categories. Take a look at them, read the applicable rules and restrictions at the bottom, then type out your nominee for as many of those 16 categories as possible. All 16 would be ideal, but please no fewer than 12. And then once you've got that all typed out, email it into bestof@comicgeekspeak.com sometime before the end of the day on April 15th, 2018. Easy to remember. It's usually tax day. But this year, it's it's a Sunday, so it's best of day. So please, if you're interested in participating in this process and making your voice heard in what our listenership thinks are the best of comics of 2017, get that ballot together and email it to us by April 15th.
And also another bit of housekeeping, as Pants would say. Mm-hmm. I wanted to extend on behalf of all the cast members our profound gratitude to some of the incredibly magnanimous donations we've been receiving through our website. As you know, in the past couple episodes I've been on, I've been, requesting that people just a couple dollars, $2, $5 donate so we can maintain the show and keep the lights on and so forth. As the comics world gets a little more threadbare, and some of the donations have been so above and beyond what we asked. Again, our deepest thanks to all those people, you know who you are, who send in very generous donations. But having said that, any donation, even just a few dollars, is greatly appreciated. Just go to the bottom of our website page, hit the donate button, and if you can, please, really appreciate it, and it helps us keep the show going. So thank you again very much.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much, all of you out there in CGS land, for answering the clarion call. All right, now. CGS Goes to War. Now, this is a new type of episode, not too drastically different. It's still comic talk, and it's same voices you've heard for years, so you've got an idea what to expect. But we're broaching a different genre here now, going into war comics. And Chris, this new format is kind of your battle plan. It's an opportunity to fuse a couple of your greatest interests, comic books and military history. So, why don't you say a few words, Chris, about this new format that we're experimenting with here?
Thank you, brother. For years I've been thinking about ways I could, as you said, sort of bring both of those two of those great passions of mine, comic books and military history, to the show. And we've talked about various war comics over the years on the air, of course, characters and so forth. But I've always wanted to get a little more sort of down and dirty, so to speak, at least sort of plunge more in depth into particular characters or stories in that genre. And I was rereading recently one of my all-time favorite war comics, which we're going to discuss tonight, which is Enemy Ace, War in Heaven by Garth Ennis. And this is a book I've wanted to discuss on the air for quite a few years, actually. And I thought, all right, we got some space in the schedule. Let's come up with a new format. So one of the things we do best in the show? We talk and critique comics. No one does that better than Murd, in my humble opinion. And let's fuse that, of course, and let's fuse that to my beloved war genre in comics. And so the way we're going to do this, we'll do this theme every once in a while. We'll get Shane and Pants, we'll have people involved down the road. Everybody brings to the table a war comic they particularly enjoy. And, we'll do like the typical sort of off-the-rack approach. We'll critique and discuss, so spoilers aplenty, obviously. Mm-hmm. And we'll also provide some sort of historical context as we can as we move along through the various stories we'll be selecting.
Most of it coming from Chris, because it is, after all, his field and his profession.
Perhaps, my friend, but let's not sell short your sort of Renaissance knowledge. So,
okay, let's call it that. Yeah,
indeed. So, Murd, why don't you just tell everybody what you selected?
Oh, all right. All that said, I must confess I had to dig a little bit into my own drawer box-contained collection of comics to find something that would be worthy of attention within this new format, because I'm really not, I must confess, such a fan of war comics as such. Usually the war comics I read need to have some element of fantasy, whimsy, and or superheroism for me to become engaged. So if we're going to do war comics, usually most of the war comics in my collection are going to be things like All-Star Squadron, Dinosaur Island, Creature Commandos, that kind of thing.
Great. All great.
But if we're looking for slightly more realistic war comics, my collection doesn't offer a wealth of possible subject matter. But I did come up with something, a favorite comic of mine that I picked up in the late 90s, a few years before the beginning of the time bubble, which picked up, I think, with comics that I was reading in either early 2001, late 2000. It was released in late spring of 1998. And it was a part of the Vertigo Visions series of one-shots that Vertigo did for the period of time in the 90s. They did about half a dozen of them, and they were all one-shot stories having to do with pre-existing DC Comics characters, but given a decidedly adult, sometimes surreal and disturbing Vertigo twist. That Prez Smells Like Teen President one-shot that Chris and I so enjoy.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Well done.
Oh, of course. I mean, it's Brubaker and Eric Shanower. I mean, it's a fantastic creative team. And we've talked about that one before. But this one came out a little bit later. This is from 1998. I bought it in Canada during my first ever trip north of the border. I was during a mini concert tour of the Penn State University Choir at the end of my freshman year of college. We just went to Montreal and Ottawa, and I happened to stop by a comic shop in a shopping center in Ottawa, and they had this on the shelf. And I was able to read it while traveling around Canada. Well, mainly just traveling from Ottawa back to Pennsylvania. But anyway, there were trees in the background, so it was appropriate setting for reading the story I'm talking about, which is, not to bury the lead, Tomahawk, the Vertigo Visions Tomahawk one-shot, put out in 1998, written by Rachel Pollack, with art by Tom Yates. And it's just a single, self-contained, 64-page one-shot story, giving us an origin, a secret origin, if you will, of the classic DC Comics Revolutionary War era character Tomahawk, alias Thomas Hawk, master frontiersman and foe of the Tory hordes, who was first introduced in DC Comics in the pages of Star Spangled Comics, number 69, I think it was, in 1947, created by Fred Ray. So this is a character that had already been around for half a century by the time this one-shot came out. And the tale of how Tomahawk came to be had been reimagined once or twice. I don't believe he ever got a story in the Secret Origins series of the 80s, of which I am so fond. But this is kind of a secret origin story for him. Definite... In my view, improvement over the original origin the character had, which was first told back in the Golden Age, which involved Thomas Hawk being captured by Native Americans during a trip out to the frontier Midwest, and then that group of Indians being attacked by an animal of some sort. I think it was a moose, actually. And Thomas Hawk using his mighty white man powers to save this band of American Indians from this moose. And then they were so grateful they decided to teach him their ways, and which he then brought back to white civilization further east and used to help fight the British in the American Revolutionary War, sometimes by himself and sometimes leading a group of secondary characters, sort of his lieutenants, his crack squad of specialists known as Tomahawk's Rangers. And Tomahawk actually had a kind of a long history in DC Comics in the Golden and Silver Ages, and even into the Bronze Age. His son, Hawk, son of Tomahawk, became kind of a mainstay in the Western genre, transferring the setting for the adventures from the late 18th century to the early to mid-19th. But this story of Tomahawk, it takes us back to the character's roots, and it sort of reimagines how Thomas Hawk gained his wilderness survival skills that served him so well as a foe of the British during the American Revolutionary War. It's set the end of 1773 through into 1774. So Again, this is sort of stretching the definition of war comics for us to be talking about this one. It really sort of takes place amidst the rumblings of war, before the American Revolution had officially begun. But certainly some of the things that are shown happening in this comic, and a couple of the figures that appear herein, or at least are mentioned, sort of suggest a preamble to the American Revolution to follow. But it's the story of a British settler, Thomas Hawk, who lives in Boston in the Massachusetts colony, whose spirit is sort of restless. He's troubled by dreams and visions of a Native American shaman of sorts. He's envisioning himself clashing with. These dreams are sort of defining himself subconsciously against the so-called savages dwelling just beyond the tenuous borders of colonial civilization in this new world. He is romantically linked with young Miss Emily Johns, whose father is a British loyalist preacher in the Anglican Church in the United States, and her brother is a man named Theodore, who is a friend of Thomas Hawk's and also involved in the early stirrings of revolutionary sentiment. Both Thomas and Theodore participate in the famous Boston Tea Party. There's a long scene there in which, funnily, Thomas Hawk is one of the few participants who does not choose to costume himself as an American Indian tribesman to go onto this boat in the Boston Harbor and throw tea into the water.
Nobody was fooled by that.
So Thomas was just like, why bother? But then one thing leads to another, and due in part to the reckless actions of Emily Johns, for which she is completely penitent later on, a local group of American Indians, they're identified as Wampanoag, which is one of the Narragansett tribes, comes under danger of attack by her zealous brother, Theodore, who not only is pro-separation from England, he's also all in favor of eradication of the quote-unquote savages, so that the British colonists, settlers, the new Americans, can completely take over this territory that they've settled. So Thomas Hawk is among a party that goes out to drive these Wampanoag away. He ends up getting separated from the party, though. He's actually chased away from them by a pack of wolves, which will become a recurring image in not only this comic, but in the next one we'll talk about, the one that Chris will introduce to you shortly. Spirit wolves are kind of the hidden link between these two war comics. But he falls in with a group of Wampanoag, one of whom, we are told, his name is Sangquam, and he, we are told, was, as a youth, taken from his parents by some priests from the old world and basically beaten and tortured into learning the English language and being forcibly Europeanized. And eventually he was able to get away and return to his tribe, but his dubious profit by this experience is he can now speak English. So he becomes the translator for Thomas Hawk as he during his time with the Wampanoag. They decide that they are going to civilize Hawk, just as Sangquam was civilized years ago. And so that is how instead of their teaching their ways to him out of gratitude for having rescued them from a moose, they decide that it's in their best interest. And also the tribal shaman, the Jessa Kid in their language, the spirit talker, decides that their guardian spirit, Grandmother Wolf, mother of all the spirits of nature in their belief system, has decreed that he must be with them. He is going to be the key to their people's survival during the upcoming Revolutionary War. So there you go. There's your connection between this story and the upcoming American Revolution. Grandmother Wolf knows what's going on. So he is forced to remain amongst the Wampanoag. Meanwhile, his love, Emily Johns, is she feels terrible for what has happened to him. She feels responsible not only for her lover vanishing, but also for the Wampanoag being driven from their campgrounds. So she is taking her own steps to see to their survival, and so she actually, there's one scene in a drawing room somewhere where she is consulting with none other than Abigail Adams,
yes,
historical wife of John Adams, who is one of the most vocal proponents of American independence, and also the second president of the United States eventually. So Emily meets with her and tries to get her to promise to do whatever she can to help the condition of the the American Indians. And on the very next scene, the Wampanoag shaman is consulting with Grandmother Wolf as to what is to be done with Thomas Hawk, and Grandmother Wolf is adamant that he has an important part to play in the survival of both their peoples in the upcoming conflict. So it's kind of interesting juxtaposition of those two scenes where Emily goes to see Abigail Adams, and she's kind of like her Grandmother Wolf. Just strong elder female authority figures, one mortal and one not so much. And eventually Thomas Hawk is abandoned by the Wampanoag for his own good, just apparently for him to find his way into the bosom of Grandmother Wolf. They must abandon him, and he then comes under the direct care of a pack of wolves. So, who are like the quote-unquote dream children of Grandmother Wolf. So here's where things start to depart a little bit from the more or less historical realism that we've seen so far and become a little bit more fantastical. So Thomas Hawk is not only taught the ways of the Wampanoag, he also is taught the ways of the wolf. And eventually he is able to fashion his own Tomahawk, which is drawn in this comic in a manner that I think must be more authentic to the way the actual Native American implement looked, as opposed to just a small hatchet, which is the way tomahawks were usually drawn in comics over the past decade, certainly in the 40s and 50s when Tomahawk was at the peak of his popularity in the Golden Age. So Tomahawk has a more authentic-looking tomahawk, which he uses to survive in the wilderness. And while he's out there, he on his own, he develops an interesting kind of hybrid spirituality. Call it Christian animism, in which he has not departed from the faith of his fathers, but he sort of expanded it to include the beliefs of the Wampanoag, so that now he's a believer not only in the Judeo-Christian God, but also in the nature spirits, including Grandmother Wolf. He actually has a vision of her. It's an interesting page. Him standing there in a clearing, he sees Grandmother Wolf, larger than life, suckling all kinds of different creatures at her teats, including what appears to be a Caucasian child. And then he's startled from this reverie and realizes that he's actually seeing just a normal wolf suckling her cubs, and his old friend Theodore and a couple of his compatriots are about to shoot it. And it is at this point, near the end of the story, that Thomas Hawk, a.k.a. Tomahawk, returns to European-derived society, colonial society here in the New World. And he sort of goes along with Theodore's suggestion that he put his newfound skills to work for the revolutionary cause, that he can act as an interpreter and a go-between with the local tribes, and he can also help to ambush the British using his stealth wilderness skills. And he also has kind of a joyful reunion with his lover Emily Johns towards the end of the story. And you can sort of picture the writer Rachel Pollack having assuming that she had in mind to use this as a sort of pilot for an upcoming series of Vertigo Tomahawk stories she might be able to write. I don't really know what the idea was, if there was going to be any more stories like this, or if this was planned as nothing but a one-shot. But if there were going to be an ongoing series, you can sort of imagine Pollack setting up Emily Johns as kind of like the Diane Belmont to Tomahawk's Wesley Dodds, if you will. It seems like she had in mind for these two to work together, albeit in different ways, to aid the revolutionary cause. And the final page is just a full-page splash of Thomas Hawk, his wild man beard shaved off, but he is wearing his buckskin outfit and his coonskin cap, wielding his new and improved authentic tomahawk against a bunch of redcoats. And there's kind of a background scene which might be a couple of the Tomahawk Rangers. It might be Dan Hunter, or it might just be Tomahawk again. I would kind of like to have seen what this creative team's take on Tomahawk's Rangers would have been, for example. But yeah, it's a satisfying story. It's got I think a lot more historically authentic than any of the stories about Tomahawk published in the 40s or 50s could possibly have been. Not that I've read very many of them. For those of us who've read Brian Wood's Rebels series through Dark Horse, it dovetails pretty nicely in topic and in tone with that. It's a tale of the stirrings of the American Revolution and a new take on a classic DC Comics character. So I very much enjoyed it back in 1998, and 20 years later, I find I enjoy it no less.
Well, Murd, I want to applaud you for the selection, because I've always wanted to know more about Tomahawk because I know very little about the character beyond the fact that he existed.
Mm-hmm.
That he seemed to be a riff on like the Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett type.
Oh, totally.
Motif, which was very popular in the 1950s, for example. And I knew he fought the British. I knew he had a son, but was the son supposed to be like a Wild West character, essentially?
Yeah. It was set much further out to the west, and he was of half American Indian lineage, because eventually, contrary to his reunion with Emily Johns in this story, Tomahawk did, DC continuity tells us, marry an Indian. I think she was the daughter of a chief, Moonfawn, I think her name was, and he moved out to the prairie. And that is where Hawk, son of Tomahawk, was born. So, yes, his adventures were set in the Wild West.
Now, is Emily a character who was in the original stories, or no?
I don't think so. I mean, I can't verify that, but I don't believe she existed in the earlier Tomahawk stories.
Well, what I liked about – well, I really enjoyed this story, period, and I definitely agree that it was very much in keeping with the tone of Rebels by Brian Wool, which I've just been adoring over the past couple of years when it's come out. There's been a couple arcs of that. But – what I liked about that final page, I've had the same feeling that this would be a great setup, that final page, for either an ongoing Tomahawk series in that vein or a series of one-shots. I'm sorry they didn't do that, if that ever was the original intention.
Definitely agree.
But like you said, like Diane to Wesley Dodds or Margot to the Shadow, like, it's been great to see this team in action. May I hold forth a bit on it, sir?
Oh, please do. As much length as you want.
Thanks, honey. Murd, I concur wholeheartedly in that. I really enjoyed the attention to detail. Now, again, it's a DC character, so obviously there's going to be some sort of mystical elements that we brought into it. Now, was that associated with Tomahawk before, the mystical elements, or no?
I'm sure some of his stories involved mysticism and possibly even Native American mysticism, but I don't think the character himself was as deeply immersed in that culture or its mysticism as he is in this one shot.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, considering when this book was created in the late '90s, popular culture was more aware about at that point, cognizant of American Indian shamanism, mysticism, the history, and obviously when you think about the progression of the way the American Indians portrayed in U.S. popular culture, this book's obviously a long way from some of the westerns of the 1940s and 50s where the Indians are like just there to fight and to shoot at and for them to take captives and so forth. So this story is very much in keeping with the tradition of films like Dances with Wolves, Last of the Mohicans, and accompanying other stories in film and book where they're giving you more insight into the world of the American Indian of that time, making them obviously more human, more complex. Well, actually, Murray, what I found very interesting, could you go to page 12, please?
Happy to. Right, and these DC Comics at this period in time had large page numbers down at the bottom, so that makes it easy. All right, so page 12, this is when Emily Johns first encounters the Wampanoag. And
what I found interesting about this page was Emily, they're definitely making Emily out to be, not a typical 18th century colonial woman, in that she's very outspoken for the time period, headstrong, independent, and she's drawn to, what they would call the savages and their world. She actually goes out into the woods to try to interact with one of the settlements. And we have to point out that when we talk about the Indians of the colonial period, these are not Indians chasing buffalo, right? Those are the nomadic Indians of the plains, like the Sioux, the Arapaho, Pawnee, etc., who most whites are not interacting with yet. These are the Indians who lived in sort of static villages. They didn't use horses because they're living in the forests. They had villages and they hunted and they grew crops and so forth. But if you look at that page, Murray, what I found interesting was she clearly gets sort of like some sexual excitement about exploring this Indian village. She actually wants to touch one of the male Indians she meets. Like, you certainly are a handsome one. Do your women find you exciting? And so in a sense, the author's playing on that sort of classic colonial, the exotic, native person is seen as like almost a titillation to the foreigner who kind of traipses into the world.
A bit of the other.
What's that, Murd?
A bit of the other, I remarked.
Yes, but then she takes that, she kind of flips it on its head, and we're looking a lot of this for the Indians' reaction to it and how they reacted and their perspective on it. So this is a lot more than just the white man's view on the noble savage type of motif. And Emily actually comes to regret tremendously doing this because that's, as you mentioned, that's why her brother leads that raiding party to go into the village. They feel that something's happened to, her, and then Tomahawk vanishes, as you meant, or Thomas Hawk vanishes, as you mentioned. But I really enjoy them fusing the two worlds, and that's why I've always wanted to read more Tomahawk because I love the history of the American Revolution. I'm always fascinated by the history and culture of the various Native American tribes, and you get a nice fusion of that in the story. And the artwork is gorgeous. It almost had like a Prince Valiant quality to it. Obviously, a different time period, but very illustrative. I can easily imagine reading this in a Sunday newspaper strip over however many months. Go ahead, Murd. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just kind of making little noises of agreement because you're absolutely right. This is Prince Valiant-like, and it would be cool to see a Sunday Tomahawk strip. Yeah,
and I wanted to point out that because the Tomahawk character is really kind of rooted in the stereotype of the rough-hewn, rough-and-ready American frontiersman. And for example, historically, he may have been based on, and characters like him, on the historical figure Robert Rogers, who's often considered the father of U.S. Special Forces. And he was a frontiersman who was well-versed in the military tactics of the American Indian, which today we would call guerrilla warfare, basically. And he formed a group called Rogers Rangers. And as you know, the U.S. Army today has an elite unit called the Rangers. And they specialized in basically in the Indian way of war. And like during the French and Indian War, which in Europe is called the 7 Years' War, that's the context of Last Mohicans takes place in, which is a fictionalized take on some of the events of that war. The Rangers played a key role, sort of raiding behind French lines or into Indian villages and using those types of tactics, which were often quite brutal, frankly, because we're talking about more close quarters stuff, to drive back French imperial ambitions in British North America. And I think Tomahawk is very much in the vein of that type of character. And it was really fun. This is actually the first complete Tomahawk story I've ever read. I'm sorry to say I've had very little exposure to this character, but just knowing that he exists and the basics of his world. So this for me, this was a great introduction. Now, Murd, do you say Tomahawk was introduced in the 1940s?
That's right, 1947.
Okay. And DC was publishing him into the 1970s, weren't they? I want to say they were, in one form or another.
Yeah, I think you're right, actually. And of course, his son Hawk, son of Tomahawk, was concurrent in the Bronze Age. But as we've said, he was really more of a Western character than a Revolutionary War character.
Did Grant Morrison use Tomahawk in some of his wacky Batman stories? I feel like he did.
It's possible. I guess he could have shown up somewhere in like The Return of Bruce Wayne, but I don't. Yeah, I don't know that for certain. And he did make an appearance, a couple of them actually, in Crisis on Infinite Earths. He was focused on for a couple of panels, and he also appeared in one of the Firestorm issues, crossing over with Crisis. That's he and one of his Rangers, Dan Hunter, both. So that's actually the only other full Tomahawk story I've read besides this one shot.
Murd, I was counting on a Crisis reference.
Happy to provide it.
Well done. Yeah, and what I always find interesting about a story like this is, there's a lot of stereotypes that are applied to and preconceptions applied to the colonial / American Revolutionary War era, and one of them is that the British marched around the open like jerks and lions in their bright red coats, and we hid behind trees and shot them. The war really wasn't like that in the sense that most of the battles were actually fought by the two armies marching out in their lines and shooting each other with volley fire, which is why the British won a lot of those battles actually, until we got more experience and training as the war progressed. But you did have that element of the war where you had characters like a Tomahawk who, militiamen or frontiersmen very well versed in sort of the Indian way of war, going back to the French-Indian War and further. And there were incidents during the Revolution where that kind of tactic was brought into play, like around the Battle of Saratoga, for example. So I thought this book was, again, just the attention to historical detail, fused nicely with sort of the supernatural aspects of the Tomahawk character. And I like how they kind of have him at the end as a man sort of both worlds. And that we have to remember that, regardless of how individual white people might have felt, the basic premise was that the Indians were in the way and the settlers were coming and they wanted that land and the resources contained therein. And regardless of whatever treaties might have worked out at times or arrangements, ultimately it always ended up being the same thing. The natives were going to get pushed back or killed. It's interesting having a character like a Tomahawk who is caught between those two worlds, essentially. Like he's going to fight the British because he's still a white guy who sympathizes with that cause, but I'd be interested to see if they took this approach to the Tomahawk further, like the way it's established in the story. Inevitably, he's going to have to choose between those two worlds, and so will Emily. I love the use of Abigail Adams. Also, I'm looking at that page now because she was an historical figure, was a very outspoken person, highly educated woman. She could read and speak Latin, for example, which many people were illiterate in that time period, let alone not being able to read and speak Latin. And women were not often given the same basic opportunities as men. So it's great to see her in the story, and you can imagine her being sympathetic to an Emily-type character. They're both, strong, intelligent, outspoken women. So great way to kind of suffuse historical characters into this sort of historical fiction. As I go through the pages, who was the artist again?
His name was Tom Yates.
Gorgeous. Oh, the scenes of him in the woods and the snow, learning how to survive, and like eating the wrong mushrooms, and surrounding the wolves. And again, a great touch, Murd, that I didn't realize both our selections are linked by that sort of wolf spirit concept. So, but this is again, you don't see this often. It's a first-rate, one-and-done, one-shot, and a nice reimagining of a classic sort of DC, war genre type character.
Yep. I think most, if not all, of the Vertigo Vision's one-shots were good for that. I mean, we've already spoken to the quality of Prez, Smells Like Teen President. But there was one featuring Brother Power the Geek, also written by Rachel Pollack, art by Mike Allred. The last one in the series, which came out a little later in '98 than Tomahawk, was a Dr. 13 one. There were also ones focusing on Phantom Stranger and Dr. Occult.
Yes, I've never read those. How are they?
I don't think the Phantom Stranger one was precisely to my taste because I don't remember very much about it. I'm not sure if I've even read the Dr. Occult one, but I liked the Brother Power the Geek one quite a bit. It's a little sobering compared to the full-on 60s wackiness, Joe Simon trying to speak to the love generation of the original Brother Power the Geek comics. It's much darker than that, but it's still high quality, again, by Rachel Pollack. And the Dr. 13 one I don't think I've read either.
Well, I'm sure we can hunt those down in back issue bins for cheap. Mm-hmm. And of course, if one doesn't have the time or the means to do that, like for this Tomahawk story, I just pulled it off Comixology because I didn't have a chance to hunt it down in a hard copy. So I must admit, not that I'm ever going to depart my beloved floppies until the market falls out from beneath them, but it was convenient to be able to pull this right up online for the purposes of this episode. But I'm looking again at that final splash page, Murd. Talk about a perfect setup for future stories if they ever were going to pursue that.
It brings the story that Pollack and Yates have been telling right up into line with some readers' memories of Tomahawk as a character.
Oh yeah, definitely him in the coonskin cap, wielding the tomahawk, the musket in one hand as he wards off a detachment of British redcoats. So it looks like Emily's going to act as a spy and so forth as well. So yeah, Murd, great choice, man.
Yeah, it's a favorite story of mine that if not a true war comic, is at least war adjacent. it sets the stage for Tomahawk's role in the revolution. And there's certainly quite a few dimensions of conflict in here. I mean, as you said, Chris, the conflict between the European settlers and the Native Americans was ongoing, blossoming into formal engagements at times. So there's that as a backdrop. And there's also kind of an interesting, you might say that the war depicted in this story is more internal. It's an interesting conflation of the classical conflicts between man versus nature and man versus himself, which we see raging inside of Thomas Hawk as he tries to come to grips with his own fear of being absorbed and seduced by the wilderness, by the nature of this new continent, and how he must settle that conflict before he can win the conflict with his own inner turmoil and become the whole person that will eventually be Tomahawk, soldier of the revolution. So a couple of sort of micro conflicts that need to be solved before a war by the traditional definition can begin for the Tomahawk character. But
indeed.
Yeah, I thought this was one that you would enjoy, Chris, because as we've said, it is similar to a comic that you've professed to love very much, Brian Wood's Rebels.
Oh yeah, and I think we should point out just for the historical record is that during the Revolution, many of the Indian tribes that were affected sided with the British because they felt the British were less of a threat to them because there were just not as many British prisoners as there were American colonists, many of whom were naturally hungry for westward expansion. Mm-hmm. So that's again, it'd be interesting to imagine with Pollock's approach to this. Pollock's the author, right?
Right.
Okay, how she would approach that playing out over the years of that history. So, yeah, top marks for this book. Well done.
So that would we're not going to bother to rank these via the usual off the rack system because obviously they're all buys to us, or otherwise they wouldn't be in our collection. But yep, this is certainly a buy. It would be a buy for me if we were doing that.
All right.
Time to change gears and change wars?
Yes. So now we're going to move forward into the 20th century and, of course, the most cataclysmic conflict thus far in human history, which is the Second World War. And I remember when so we're doing Enemy Ace, War in Heaven. So the author is Garth Ennis, one of my favorite writers who's really carved a niche for himself as sort of the premier sort of war comic writer in the medium today. Art on the covers is Christian Alamy, and I believe he does the first issue. And in the second issue is drawn by the legendary Russ Heath, which is a massive treat as he draws the various fighter planes in the second part. This is a two-part miniseries, prestige format covers. It came out in 2001. I remember my excitement. That's when I had my store briefly in my Westfield, New Jersey location before I went to Kenilworth. When this came out, because I love Garth Ennis' work on Preacher, but I didn't realize he was such a lover of the war comic genre. And this is my first exposure to him writing war comics, and a character I always found fascinating. We should remind the readers, listeners, if they don't know, that the Enemy Ace character has quite a long history. Sort of like, we're in sync here because we chose two classic DC war characters that were both being reimagined by modern, more recent creators.
How about that?
So, Enemy Ace, or Hans von Hammer, he first appeared in Army at War, issue 151, 1965, created by sort of an ongoing presence in terms of DC's war comics, the writer Robert Kanigher, who was also famous for writing Wonder Woman, actually.
And created the Metal Men in over a weekend, he boasted while he was still alive, I should say. Indeed.
And the artist, of course, is probably the most legendary figure when it comes to DC's war comics creators, which is the great Joe Kubert. And what's interesting about Enemy Ace was that he was the enemy. He was a German. So they put him in World War I. And as I'm looking at the cover now from that classic, many people have seen this cover. Now, only DC dares reveal the enemy side of the war. In his own magazine, Killer of the Skies. Excuse me, a classic Joe Kubert cover of two World War I era biplanes in a dogfight with Hans von Hammer sort of as a shadowy figure in the background. So he appeared in '65, and I remember I got when I was a kid, there was a period of time where I kept getting the classic Fireside reprint books for various holiday gifts in the late 70s and early 80s, and I got America at War, which was a collection of DC war comics. Totally floored me. It was my first exposure to the Haunted Tank, Sergeant Rock, Enemy Ace, and I knew very little about World War I at that time. Like I'd heard of the Red Baron, von Richthofen and all that, but not much more. So I devoured these stories. I'd always try to find them of this character because I'm always interested in the other side and sort of how they perceive an event differently from the side you're accustomed to in a conflict. And that just always makes great literature. And the Enemy Ace stories, the originals, were fascinating in that this was a lethally skilled fighter pilot. I mean, sort of like the Red Baron of the DC universe in World War I. And, how he sort of had this fatalistic attitude towards what he was doing, about his own life. He would often honor his opponents and sort of salute them as he shot them down. He'd have his victory cups, and they'd often have him go hunting, and he'd always be accompanied by a wolf. And it's almost like he had like a mystical connection to the wolf, that the wolf kind of symbolized like sort of the predatory spirit that it was inside Von Hammer as a fighter pilot, ravishing Joe Kubert artwork. And he was a character that appeared, throughout the heyday of DC's war comics in the 1960s and 1970s. And I remember, was it the 1980s, the artist George Pratt did a graphic novel called Enemy Ace War Idol, which beautifully painted. I read it many years ago. It was fantastic. It's a young person coming to Enemy Ace really old. He's in a nursing home and interviewing him about his war experiences. And the interviewer is a Vietnam veteran, so they're sort of bonding in a way over their shared experiences in combat. It's a classic. But that was kind of the last you heard of the character until this. And what I loved about this story is that Ennis doesn't wipe away any of Enemy Ace's history. This is, in effect, a sequel. And it answers the question probably many Enemy Ace fans always had was, what did Von Hammer do during World War II? Because he would have been in his 40s probably, a middle-aged man. No doubt still a highly skilled pilot. So did he fight for the Nazis? Was he opposed to them? Because he comes across as a man of honor ultimately in the original Silver Age stories. And Ennis, again, the research he puts into his military comics is breathtaking. But you have Von Hammer sort of living in isolation in his Bavarian castle on a mountaintop in 1942. One of his old comrades from the First World War, who's now a pilot in the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force of World War II, which is one of the premier air forces of that conflict. His old comrade Peter comes and says, look, we're fighting the Russians, we're losing pilots, we need your expertise and your leadership. And Von Hammer, is hesitant. I'm a middle-aged man. He's not a fan of the Nazis. We find out that some of his old comrades in the Luftwaffe are protecting him from political retaliation because he made derogatory comments about the Nazis. But he feels like, all right, I have to come out, not even so much for country, but that's what he is. He's a pilot, and that's what he does best. So that takes us to the front outside Leningrad, the northern sort of front on the eastern front of World War II. The siege of that city, which was horrific, which went on for a couple of years. Many, many Soviet citizens in Leningrad died of starvation during that siege. And you have Von Hammer taking his squadron up, and again, they paint his plane red, his Messerschmitt, like his old World War I biplane. It's about him navigating the politics. Like one of the officers in his squadron is a diehard Nazi loyalist, and for example, Von Hammer refuses to give the Heil Hitler salute, which raises eyebrows. And it's in the artwork in this two issues is so breathtaking. The way they capture aerial combat. They really did their research on the types of Soviet planes and German planes, the tactics that were used, the detail in the uniforms. And again, this is about a man who kind of lived life through sort of a tunnel vision of combat. That's what he knew. That's what he was good at. That's what he was drawn to, regardless of how he may feel about it in more, relaxed or intellectual moments. And it's about a man trying to just kind of maintain his sense of honor and sort of his warrior's ethos of dignity while fighting for one of the most barbaric regimes in human history. And I think what the book reminds us of is the German war machine in World War II, which came from a long-standing tradition from the Prussian military and the World War I Kaiser Army, is so highly skilled and lethally efficient. But again, it's acting in the service of a monstrous regime. And you see throughout the story as Von Hammer starts to slowly realize, as he sees the sufferings of the Soviet people, because he's shot down at one point, not shot down, he's actually hit by one of his own planes. And he sees that the Soviet people suffering, some of them turning to cannibalism. Mm-hmm. He sees their bravery as a young partisan boy is killed trying to throw a Molotov cocktail or a grenade at a German tank. And as Murd mentioned, there's a scene where because he's been shot down, he's freezing, and he's cornered by Red Army soldiers, and you think they're going to kill him, and then the wolf appears and proceeds to tear the Russian troops to pieces. And what Ennis does very skillfully is that because this is a motif from the original comic, you often would see him hunting with the wolf on his R&R moments. But now Ennis makes you question, was the wolf ever really there, or is the wolf just sort of the expression of the violence that's within Von Hammer and what a killer he actually is? Because at the end of that scene, it is Von Hammer, his hands coated in blood, standing above these men that you assume he himself has killed. And when he returns to the squadron, it's just him trying to keep his men alive, and they get the German jet, the Messerschmitt 262, which it was introduced at the very end of World War II, too late to have a decisive effect on the conflict because it did help the Nazis, stave off defeat. Interesting backstory: Hitler's commanders urged him to make this a fighter plane, but he wanted to make it more like a bomber, so that delayed production of it. And by the time it was introduced at the very end of the war, Germany was literally running out of pilots and to fly them, and they were highly effective, but there just weren't enough of them and not enough men to fly them effectively. In fact, when my grandfather fought in Europe, he's still living, we still talk about the war, he remembers the first time he saw one of the German jets, and they all thought it was a UFO. Because it just went, they just heard, and they couldn't even see anything, essentially.
Ooh.
But the book does a wonderful job of the impact of the technology, how it changes the way they fight, and also the impact of fighting for this regime. And the crux of the story follows Von Hammer's friendship with his Peter. And there's a great scene in the second volume where Peter talks about his own struggle with fighting for the Third Reich. And Ennis is not making excuses for the culpability of so many of the members of the German military, but he's just laying out really things from their perspective. And there's a scene where Von Hammer ends up parachuting into a concentration camp, and he sees what the Nazis have been doing, and then he's determined then to try to, at least in his own small way, bring the war to a close. To me, this is one of the best war comics I've ever read. Again, the art, especially the Russ Heath art, in the second issue is so breathtaking. The depictions of aerial combat, but especially always going back to the character, and Ennis celebrating the origins of the character, not dispensing any of it, but also sort of bringing him into the complexities of the Second World War, and how does a noble man, let's call him the noble warrior, reconcile with fighting for Adolf Hitler? And it doesn't get much better than this, folks. So seek out the trade, or in the back issue bins, or on Comixology. Enemy Ace, War in Heaven. Bird, what'd you think?
Well, I would second a lot of the praise you had for this, Chris. I mean, it's just, whether you like war comics or not, it's beautifully done on both the writing side and the art side. I mean, this is something that I actually did have in my collection. This is a war comic that I did own and had read several years ago. And so when you suggested, hey, let's do a special episode where we talk about this, I was like, I have that, and I liked that, so let's do it. And so I was able to dig this out of my box. I didn't even need to go to Comixology or wherever. I was able to just dig this out, and I was reminded then of just what a great comic it was, because it's those of you who've been listening to Comic Geek Speak for a while will remember me talking up Marvel's The 12 when it was published. Written by J. Michael Straczynski with art by Chris Weston. And the first of the two 48-page prestige format volumes of this miniseries. As Chris mentioned, it was broken. The breakdown art of issue 1 was provided by Christian Alamy. Chris Weston then comes in and does the finished art, and
it's beautiful.
By glory. And it's this man was just born to delineate scenes of early to mid 20th century Western life. I mean, his drawing, it opens on an aerial shot of Hans von Hammer's ancestral Bavarian castle, and there's his friend Peter, who shows up to recruit him for the Luftwaffe, remarks to himself, "Christ Almighty, he lives in Castle Dracula." And it's the detail of the centuries-old, like medieval furnishings and reliefs of the interior of this castle are just breathtaking. And then when the scene shifts from there to Luftwaffe camps or depots, and we go from inside architecture to fighter planes. I mean, it's no less beautiful, whether he's depicting interior design or killing machines. I mean, the man was just, as I said, born to draw stuff from the 30s, 40s, and thereabouts. I mean, his art looked fantastic on the 12. It looks no less fantastic here. And the art from issue number 2, of course, is beautiful in a different way. Russ Heath's art is a little bit less detailed and ornate, but as Chris said, he knows how to show scenes of fighter planes in action. It's just they are balletic, and Heath has more than a little bit of experience drawing classic war comics from DC. So he's kind of he like Von Hammer himself. He's kind of the old veteran who's pressed into service for a new cause. Indeed. With this project. So the art is fantastic. And the first issue also has the scene Chris mentioned of Von Hammer parachuting in behind enemy lines in Leningrad, landing in the wrong side of the city, the Russian-held part, and that's where we see him trying to slip his way out and back to rejoin his comrades. He sees scenes of human deprivation and suffering. Chris mentioned briefly a scene of cannibalism, and to be more graphic about it, it's the scene of a Russian mother staring with dead eyes at a little campfire in which she's roasting a piece of meat to feed her little daughter. And a few seconds later, we, along with Von Hammer, discover to our horror that it's a human hand that she is cooking to feed her daughter. And this.
And let me point out, if I may, that Ennis is not exaggerating in that the siege of Leningrad went on from 1941 to 1944. Hundreds of thousands of people died in that city from deprivation, especially starvation. So that kind of thing did happen. And we have to also remember that because again, from our American perspective, we often tend to overlook the Eastern Front in World War II. That's one of the most barbaric parts of World War II, because you had two ruthless dictatorships, Stalin versus Hitler, pummeling each other. I mean, they estimate about 25 million Soviet citizens died in World War II. And a lot of them were civilians. And Ennis doesn't want us to forget that. We also can't forget, and this is not necessarily popular in America, but Nazi Germany lost World War II because they invaded the Soviet Union. Yeah. And that's where they lost the bulk of their vaunted strength. Not to undercut the British or American contributions, of course, but this is where Hitler was bled to death, essentially. So, and they capture, from Von Hammer's perspective, they capture that progression. I'm sorry, Murd, go ahead.
No need to apologize at all, Chris. That was a most worthy interruption. You may interrupt me like that as much as you want. This is fantastic insight from a man who shares such insights professionally, after all. And I did have a strong suspicion that stuff like this did happen in Leningrad back in 1942. And it only seems like something, one of Ennis's trademark atrocities. But in this case, as you said, Chris, he is not exaggerating. I do believe that. So so Volume 1 is set in 1942, and it's what Von Hammer goes through when he first returns. And as Chris said, he does so mainly because he is by nature a killer, and he doesn't really know anything else to do with himself. And he's something of a fatalist too. And he was often heard to grumble to himself about how the sky is the killer of us all, and he feels kind of drawn inexorably back to those killers' skies, as if they and not he are the controllers of his destiny. And then there's the manifestation of that black wolf that we've been talking about that sort of represents or embodies the part of himself that feels drawn to those killer skies and is most indebted to them. And I do agree with you, Chris, that Ennis's construction of the ambiguity of whether or not the wolf is a real creature or just a figment of Von Hammer's imagination, just a manifestation of his own inner killer instinct. It's very well played by Ennis in this story. So yes, he's drawn back both by killer instinct, but also out of there is some element of nationalism, loyalty to fatherland, and a desire to protect hapless young men who have been drawn into another conflict in these killer skies. He wants more than anything to keep as many young German pilots alive in this new conflict as he can, and that, I think, plus his nature is what in the exhortations of his old friend Peter Stahlschmidt draw him back into World War II in the service of the Reich. And then in the second issue, we jump forward in time to 1945, different stage of the war, different theater of the war, as Von Hammer and company have been reassigned to the fatherland. They've been pulled back in as the war has gone poorly, I'm sure. Retreated to reinforce the homeland. Let me just pause in the middle of this, Chris. Have you ever? This is kind of out of left field, Chris. Have you ever heard a song called Berlin by Al Stewart, Chris?
I've heard of this song. I don't think I've listened to it, though.
It's a ballad. It's a story song, and it details the experience of a Russian soldier as he's being taken by train across the entire length of Europe and Asia to participate in the sacking of Berlin at the very end of World War II in 1945.
Yes.
It's a beautiful piece of music, and it's got historical worth, and I think, Chris, it was practically made for you. Please do me a favor. When we're done here, go to YouTube and give that song a listen.
Oh, Murd, thanks for the recommendation, brother.
Absolutely. I think of you every time I listen to it, and I do have the greatest hits of Al Stewart in the CD player in my car right now. So,
of course you do.
Give that a try. So, yes, the second issue of Enemy A's War in Heaven jumps us to shortly before that Russian soldier's train ride, as Von Hammer and company are now just trying to keep the British and American flyers at bay and just to save as many German lives as possible. And in the course of one of these aerial engagements, so the story is... There are lots of little interludes in which the characters, and I guess Garth Ennis through them, are able to stand around and muse about the state of aeronautics and aircraft design. And you understand that one of the things that Hans von Hammer loves and respects most of all is just the beauty and grace of a well-built flying machine. He takes a moment to stand and look to the sky and just say to himself, perfect, as he witnesses RAF Spitfires whizzing overhead, killing his countrymen, but still he can't help but respect the beauty of their design. They were built for, not just for speed or for firepower, but for grace and maneuverability. They were creatures of the air. And he then turns to a recently built German jet, which he likens to a toad. So this story really could have been sponsored by the Messerschmitt company, because there's an awful lot of Messerschmitts flying around. The 262s are what they'd upgraded to by the second issue. I think it was 109s they were mostly flying in the first one.
The 109 was one of the mainstays of the Luftwaffe. It was one of the premier fighter planes of World War II. They also mentioned the Focke-Wulf, which came along a little bit later. And then, of course, as the war ended, they brought in the jet, the 262, as you mentioned. But too little, too late for Germany, fortunately, for the rest of the world in that conflict. But go ahead, Murd.
And there is ongoing commentary by the characters, as you alluded to earlier, Chris, about the halting development, impeded in some parts by Hitler's own personal hang-ups and mania of different German aircraft. And if they'd only developed the jet as a flyer rather than a bomber a little sooner, and if they had increased production and upgrading of the aircraft sooner than they did, they're the leaders of von Hammer's Hauptstaffel are always complaining to the officer in their corps who has the most connections in Berlin, the Nazi loyalist Hitlerite bastard whom they Engels by name. They take the piss out of him at every opportunity. And when he finally dies on page 25 of issue 2, he's all set to shoot von Hammer for treason, and his friend Peter then activates the guns on a nearby plane and just blasts Engels into bits. And Ennis practically signed this issue when he wrote that scene, because it's just the kind of bloody violence he would put in place. But anyway, this Nazi bastard character was always making excuses for the Nazi regimes not providing adequate aircraft or adequate upgrades to the equipment for the troops, which, as you suggested, Chris, is one of the key reasons why the German air power ultimately failed. Then the most important turning point in issue number 2, which leads directly into the Engels trying to shoot von Hammer for treason and then getting shot to death himself, is that von Hammer ends up getting shot down. In fact, it's as a direct result of Engels' incompetence. He's much better as a toady and bootlicker than he is as a pilot. He accidentally disables the enemy ace's plane in midair. Von Hammer is able to successfully bail out, of course, but he happens to parachute right down into the middle of the death camp at Dachau. And so he is able to see firsthand exactly what he's been missing. There's not only in the agenda of the Third Reich, but you mentioned that speech that his friend Peter gives a little later on, where he explains what's been going on with German fascism and anti-Semitism and how it allowed the horrors that the Third Reich perpetrated to happen. Von Hammer was isolated from all of that. Because he's spent most of the years between the two world wars living in his castle in Bavaria, isolated from everything. He didn't really see the fall of the German people and the way they allowed themselves collectively to give way to their baser urges, their hatreds. He wasn't present to see them allow a demagogue talk them into allowing certain horrible things to happen. And then all at once he parachutes into Dachau and he sees what he's been missing. And you said, Chris, this is a story about a warrior and a man of honor being drawn into a foreign war. A foreign in that it's not his native conflict. It's not World War I anymore. He's not fighting for the glory of Germany or whatever drew him into that conflict. He's fighting for very different reasons, which he doesn't completely understand until then. And so he's kind of been the veteran and the outsider in this war. And now, having seen what he has seen, he can no longer continue to fight for the Third Reich with in any kind of clear conscience. He has one or two more engagements, which he fights solely to protect the fatherland and its people, outside of what the Third Reich and its insane leadership has led it into. And in the end, finally, he has another moment of crisis of conscience when he sees some people aboard an American bomber that he's just disabled, and he just says to himself, you know what, I'm not killing any more people for any of this. And he lands his plane. He bids farewell to that black wolf, which, as we said, is kind of his totem, his spirit animal, the representation of his own will to fight and to violence. And the story ends with him, we get a cameo from another well-known classic DC Comics war character, and to whom von Hammer formally surrenders. But when he first saw the atrocities at Dachau, his intention was to fly immediately to the nearest American military outpost and surrender not only himself, but an example of the latest German Messerschmitt flight vehicle, and so they can inspect it and figure out the best ways to disable and battle it, I assume. But there's enough of his old German military honor left in him that even though he surrenders himself and his men, he destroys the planes that he's been flying. And the powerful image on the very last page where he declares to the classic DC character taking him in, quote, "I am no longer your enemy." Do you want to mention that DC character is? We might as well. They could probably guess anyway. It's the best-known DC Comics war character, Sergeant Rock, Frank Rock of Easy Company. So he is the one who shows up and takes Enemy Ace in. So, and nice thing here is that Ennis not only tells a great story, answering, as you said earlier, Chris, a longtime fan question of what the heck Von Hammer was up to during World War II, if he survived that long. He also leaves it open-ended so that there's a chance to see what he was doing during later years, what he did with himself during, I don't know, the 60s or what have you. But I would like to throw out there, unrelated to what we're talking about here, though, those of you who are interested in reading some more good Enemy Ace stories set between the wars, there was a mini-series published just a year or two before Enemy Ace War in Heaven came out. It was written and drawn by Tim Truman. It was called Guns of the Dragon, and it included Enemy Ace and a few other classic DC characters, including an aging Bat Lash, classic Western character, all in Shanghai, like in the South Seas. And they all end up, they meet Vandal Savage, they all end up on Dinosaur Island before it's all over. It's kind of a fun jam story, throwing together a bunch of disparate DC historical characters and concepts, having a kind of a pulpy adventure story set in 1927.
Murd, I've never even heard of that. I'll have to check that out.
Oh, yep, it's 4 or 5 issues, and Truman, who is a fellow Pennsylvania resident and just a great creator.
He sure is.
It is a story that I would certainly recommend, and his art is beautiful there.
His style perfectly lends itself to that type of story. Mm-hmm. So, good tip, Murd. Good tip. Well, obviously you enjoyed it, War in Heaven.
Oh, yes, tremendously. And it's just, I love the way Ennis was able to just stick that in there, being faithful to all the classic Kanigher and Kubert, etc. stories that came before, and also leaving the toy unbroken in the end for other people to come along and play soldier in their own way later on. So.
And we should also know when we talk about the Kanigher-Kubert stories that a lot of those stories would involve sort of Von Hammer narrating and sort of philosophizing about, Murd often mentioned his sense of fatalism about what he was involved in, what he was doing. And Ennis definitely acknowledges that and plays that a bit in this story. They even mentioned at one point in the original stories he would have an orderly, this sort of almost Gollum-type figure who would kind of come in sniveling and shine his trophies and take off his boots and talk about his achievements. And they have a scene where Von Hammer is kind of lamenting how that guy acted, and then they have the Nazi character Engels dressing him down for speaking aristocratically about someone from the lower classes, and they get a little exchange there, and I believe that's when Von Hammer compares Hitler to an ape, if I remember correctly. But, yeah, I concur that everything that happened with Enemy Ace happened. This is what happened after, and that's one of the many things I love about this story. And if you want to seek out old Enemy Ace stories, there's an archive out there. And my version of the trade, I'm not sure which printing they have out now, also has an old Enemy Ace story in the back from the Silver Age as well. Issue 139 from Star Spangled War Stories, which is where he was featured after he initially appeared in Showcase. And the old Enemy Ace stories are great. We should mention that DC's war, DC for me is the Cadillac of the war comic genre. Like their war comics are some of the best of that genre. Now, having said that, at some point in the show, I want to talk about the book Blazing Combat, which is the classic glorious but brief Warren series, which Russ Heath was a contributor to that series. Archie Goodwin did some of the writing, which that's considered some of the best war comics ever conceived. And perhaps we'll talk about those in a future installment of CGS Goes to War. But DC has so many great war characters to explore, and of course you mentioned Sergeant Rock appearing at the end of this story, which was just appropriate that Von Hammer would surrender to Frank Rock like that. To the great grizzled war characters from their respective militaries. Mm. So we should also point out that, because again, Ennis is definitely a fan of sort of the technology of World War II, especially the German technology. And we mentioned, the jet, and Von Hammer decided to destroy the remaining jets in his squadron. Both the United States, the British, and the Soviets were trying to capture and recruit German scientists so they could use their technology in the coming Cold War, and getting the jet technology was part of that. And of course, as many people might know, NASA was built in part on Nazi science because Werner von Braun, who was the father of Germany's rocket program, became a scientist for NASA. So the history of all this is fascinating. And again, when you really think about the Third Reich, because a lot of times people will just approach sort of the Third Reich and it just simply through its military history and, as a military, some of its awesome achievements on the battlefield. But this book reminds us you cannot divorce that from the regime that it served. And I think the book does a wonderful job of dealing with that through the character of Von Hammer and Peter. There's a great scene at the end where Peter talks about how he knew, as many Germans really did, they had at least some idea that something was going on with Jewish citizens and other people who were disappearing and being taken away, and so forth. So it always goes back to one of those great questions of history when it comes to this era, which is, if something like this happened in our country or another country, how would you react? How would people respond? And that can lead to some very uncomfortable answers and reflections when people think about that and talk about it. Some would say, well, it was just the Germans because they had a warlike history and they were more susceptible to that because they didn't have democratic traditions. The Weimar Republic was their first and very flawed democratic state. Others would say that in the right circumstances, any country could find itself perverted that way. And that's a debate that continues historically as well.
It can happen here.
Yeah. So this for me is a war comic I read at least a couple times a year. So it was a real joy to trumpet it for this episode. Murd, thank you.
Oh, no, thank you, Chris. This was a great idea you had. I'm pleased to be present and contribute in some small way to your expostulation on a couple of your favorite subjects combined into one.
Well, I hope we can return. I'm sure we will return to this format at some point down the road. Get some other people involved because there's a lot of great war comics out there to discuss.
There certainly are. We have to give a special salute to our spotlighted writer in this episode, Garth Ennis, for almost single-handedly keeping the genre alive with the war-related books he continues sporadically to write for publishers like Avatar.
He does Avatar. He's done stuff for DC. I think Dynamite Entertainment, the Battlefield series. He did a modern take on the classic Johnny Red character from British War Comics who flew with the Soviets. That was a couple years ago. I talked about Dreaming Eagles, where he talks about the Tuskegee Airmen. That's a fantastic story, art by Simon Colby. Ennis is like Murd said, he is one of the main reasons there's war comics being published today. I mean, and his work with the Punisher, a book I might select down the road is Punisher Born.
Oh, right.
Which is him exploring Frank Castle serving in Vietnam. I mean, he just finished the Punisher, the Platoon miniseries, also about Castle's experiences in Vietnam. Those are tremendous. And also another book I hope to talk about down the road. I'm getting really excited here. Is when he takes on Nick Fury. And some of his experiences in the Cold War. All great stuff, meticulously researched. So
now this is the original Nick Fury, right?
Yep, the original. Yep.
All right.
So, but again, like as Murd pointed out, there's a lot of other characters done by other creators, not just by Garth Ennis or Robert Kanigher, that we can take a look at. As I mentioned, Blazing Combat's definitely on the docket.
Yep, I've got one or two possibilities in mind too. And we'll see what Shane and or Pants can come up with as well.
All right, brother, you want to talk us out here?
Happy to, my friend. All right, this episode of Comic Geek Speak, first in what will hopefully be a series of CGS Goes to War, was the Collection Drawer Company, makers of the Drawer Box Storage System. Visit them at collectiondrawer.com, order yourself a bunch of drawer boxes, and bring your collection closer to your fingertips. If you would like to send us an email, our address is comicgeekspeak@gmail.com. If you'd like to leave a voicemail, the number to call is 267-702-6642. You can like us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ComicGeekSpeak. We encourage you to go to thecomicforums.vanillaforums.com, where you can leave us feedback about this and many other episodes of our podcast. Let us know if you have any particular favorite war comics you'd like to hear us talk about in the future. Let us know what you thought about what we had to say about the two we focused on here. And also, while you're there at thecomicforums.vanillaforums.com, take a look at the list of nominees for the CGS Best of 2017 awards and get those ballots in by April 15th. We'd like to thank everyone who has donated to the show, especially recently. We really appreciate it. The show would not be what it is today without your help. And as always, we are uniting the world's mightiest heroes, one listener at a time.